Okay, so we're at a very, very exciting point in our studies because we're about to finish a chapter. I probably been saying that for weeks now, actually. And I should actually probably be one sutra ahead of where I'm at right now, but because I was so busy yesterday, I wasn't able to write the lesson plan for 150.
Is this what you did last week? That stuff on the lower right?
No, that's I think that's Gurmukhi. That's Nicole who wrote that. So yeah, you know, he says Sangat. I don't know, but I Simran. Oh yeah, Simran. You see, remembrance. Smardana would be the Sanskrit. So you see Smardana. You can see how the Gurmukhi. I believe that's Gurmukhi changes, right? Japa, Bhakti, Sadhana, it's kind of the same, Sankhya, it's the same. But yeah, that's her Gurmukhi stuff. Alright, so we are now on 149, Shurlutanamana Pragnabhyamani Vishaya Visheshar Tattva, Taj, and then 150, Taj Jasamskarta, Myasamskarta, Pratibandhani. Maybe I can start getting into 150 today. Let's see how we can do that. Anyway, just to review, we're talking about consciousness, Chitta Prasadam. Where do we get our Chitta Prasadam? Maiteri Kardinal Mulito Pakshana Sukha Dukkha Punya Punya Vishayana Bhavna. This Chitta Prasadam. 133. Mental luminosity, kenning for consciousness and light. Right? We see that happen. Then we pick it up 140. Pardamanu Padama Mahatvanto Syavasi Karda. Right? Asya, Tola and Dragonetti compellingly argue that Asya is Chitta Prasadam. Consciousness extends from the finest atom to the greatest infinity. Mahatvanto, Padama Mahatvanto, from Pardamanu to Padama Mahatvanto, Syavasikarta. Being consciousness, this is an idealist versus realism. Right? Realism is the philosophical idea that somehow matter can exist without consciousness, right? That maybe matter can live, like
a rock wouldn't have consciousness.
Yes, but somehow you could go to a planet and there would be no consciousness there, right? The moon has no consciousness on it. Prakriti, matter is just doing fine. It's going along, whether there's somebody to hear the tree fall or not, it's cruising along. Versus idealism is the idea that consciousness is fundamental to reality, that actually it's as much a part of reality as, like maybe matter, energy, consciousness. It's a fundamental. It doesn't make sense for consciousness to be an evolute of reality, Inanimate material bumps around long enough and suddenly produces consciousness does not make sense. Idealism is the idea that really fundamental to all that is consciousness, right? And the argument is that this is what Prakriti and Pradusha is. Instead of thinking of Prakriti is a realist understanding of matter, that is, whether Purusha is there or not, Prakriti keeps doing its thing. Right? That'd be realist. Really, we need to understand Prakriti idealistically. That is to say that what makes matter, that the relationship between Prakriti and Purusha is what makes Prakriti, right? Again, like we said, it goes from avyakta to vyakta, right? The manifestation of Prakriti is because of the passive activation of Pradusha, right? So we have Padamana Mahatvanto Syavasikarta. If we take Chitta Prasadam as like a more general sort of idea of consciousness, then we see that it extends all the way from the Anus all the way to the greatest reality. It's infused in everything, right? You can't really have a world without consciousness. There's some sort of degree of consciousness that is part of the world unfolding, the unfolding of the world, right? And this is how Tola and Dragonetti take 140, because it's got an ambiguous pronoun, asya, of that, right? And here you see Brian says the yogi's mastery. Taimni does the same thing. He says the yogi's mastery, and a lot of commentators and modern authors do the same thing. But really, Tolan Dragon Eddie argue that why would we suddenly be talking about the yogi?
Hey, who's Tolan Dragon Eddie? Is he modern?
It's
Yeah.
two
Yeah.
different people, right?
Tolan and Dragon Eddie.
Oh.
Yeah, they're two.
They're modern commentators?
Yeah. They wrote a really lovely book, a translation of Samadhipada, of the first chapter only.
Oh, okay. Uh-huh.
And they did a really good job with it. It's as we're coming up on the end of Samadhipada right now, it would be worth it to get their book and read it. It's very insightful, and they did a very nice job doing basically what Brian did in a lot of ways too. They have some different observations, like this is an example, and I find a lot of their perspectives, and this is probably really the prime example of, where they are like, no, it doesn't make sense to think about it like this. We need to think about it like this. And so it's a good read. It's a good read for sure. It's certainly one of the things. I've gotten to the point where I'm referring to them more than I probably am anybody else. But it's kind of unfortunate because I'm about to be done with the first chapter. They don't have a second chapter book that I'm aware of. I kind of want to write them and say, hey, my class is about to be done with Samadhipada. Can you hurry up with Sadhanapada, please? Because we need it. And then the other one that I'm looking at is Trevor Leggett, I think it is. Leggett, Leggett, I think his name is. And he does a Shankara translation, the translation of Shankara's commentary on the Yoga Sutra, which is also very good as well, too. So both of those are texts that I'm kind of citing much more than I am Taimni. That one's a little bit dated. Brian does a good job replacing that. However, he does his own little nice observations. I think his understanding of the samadhi is very interesting. Though I think that Brian and other authors do a compelling job of arguing that that's not the right way of, the sampragnata, asampragnata, as opposed to sabija and sampragnata synonymous and nirdabija and asampragnata synonymous. Taimni has a really nice way of explaining that, and to me it makes sense with the model of ekagrata, nirodha, fluctuation. So, but at the same time, I'm not entirely sure that we can argue that that's how Patanjali meant it. But for me, just as a practitioner, I think it's a very interesting way of understanding it. So I think that Taimni does a really good job of some of that stuff. But anyway, so we're talking about the consciousness, right? And of course, this becomes very important with our Savitarka, Nirvicharka, Savicharda, Nirvicharda. We've talked to death about how the inversion of quality to quantity, etc., is happening, where we start seeing material reality in increased quality, decreased quantity. The essence of Prakriti, the one thing is moving with but that's the quality, to the point where we get outside of Desha Kala, right, space-time, so this is a very interesting understanding, is that really time is kind of like a superficial, linear time is maybe a superficial way of understanding things, and that actually when you get this nirvitartika sort of awareness, when you see the quality of everything, and if you think about it, if you see everything as kind of like this, I'm hesitant to use the word monad because of the dualistic structure of Yoga Sankhya, but if you think of it as this monistic sort of Prakriti, if there's only one thing going on and that's Prakriti, then how does time work? Because time has to be like multiple things happening. So on the surface, it looks like there's a lot of different things happening, Shabda, Artha, Jnana, and Samkirna, right, and Savitartika, Samadhi. It's all working together. And then as you get rid of the Shabda and the Jnana, and you just see the Artha, and you realize that you're looking at Alinga, Shushma Visayatmam Chalinga Pardhyavasanam, you just seen Alinga. You're looking at Prakriti as just this one thing. It's not a linga, it's not a multiple different marks, but it's Alinga reality. The Shushma level of that is, then really how would time keep working? Right? Time has to be a process of multiple things interacting, but once you get down to this kind of bare bones qualitative perspective of reality, whereby you're just seeing Prakriti, then how would time work? So it's this very interesting temporal thing. I've made a lot of footnotes throughout the Pali Canon of places where there's an atemporal perception of reality. and this is very, very compelling to me, an idea that I believe comes up in the Bhagavad Gita as well, too, with, is it 212? Ashocyanam ashocismam pragnapnam shavasasi sumagata sumchcha nanushoncherti pandita natvevaham jatunasam natvam nemi janita pata nachaitadma bhavishyama sarvevaya mataha pardam. You know, never was there a time that we didn't exist, you didn't exist, I didn't exist, or all these kings, never was there a time that we will not exist. You know, this is a way of talking about the immutable nature of the soul, right? You know, it's it can't be killed, can't be burned, can't be, you know, all that sort of thing. But if you think about it, if it's immutable, then in a sense it's outside of temporal existence, because of temporal existence is mutability. So really, what you're realizing is this kind of stable center in the middle of a reality, right? And this goes all the way back to some very ancient chariot metaphors. You know, the center of the wheel.
And you're saying it's the only thing that's permanent. It's the one thing that's permanent, that doesn't change, that's non-temporal.
Yeah, but in a sense it's almost nonsensical to talk about it as permanent, because if it's atemporal, it's neither permanent or impermanent. You know, it's a non-temporal dimension of reality. Alright? And like I said, this kind of goes to, this is our very oldest understandings of karma. You know, we have this beautiful dissertation in a Kathopanishad about, you know, the center of the wheel, and how the wheel reaches its journey, and the wheel being is samsara, as the spokes and everything turning around, right? But really there's this immovable center that doesn't change, right? And that's kind of like our existence, you know, and this becomes a very interesting analogy that happens to this unchanging dimension of reality. And again, we see this in the transition from sa vitarka, nirvitarka, sa vicharda, nirvicharda, and then all of a sudden when we have the alinga, chashukshma, the shukshma, subtle level of existence, this alinga, it's not multiple, therefore it is without deshakala, it's outside of time and space, right? So what does reality look like apart from time and space? This is an interesting question, because, you know, atheists, modern scientific rational atheists might argue, you know, what you're describing doesn't exist, and I might say yes, exactly. It's outside of the existence of temporal permuting time space. And if you think all that exists is the changing nature of reality, like maybe the Buddhists might argue there's nothing else, well then maybe you're right, non-existence doesn't exist. But it's very interesting here that, as I pointed out, we have
Non-existence doesn't exist.
I like
Yeah, but according to Nyaya Visheshika, abhava, non-existence is one of the padarthas. It's one of the categories of reality. All right. So, and then I argue it like this. Well, you know, it kind of makes a little sense for non-existence to exist, because in order for something to exist, it has to be an infinite amount of things that it's not. As a matter of fact, you're probably more the things you're not than the things that you are. So really, non-existence might be an impelling force of existence. So non-existence is very existent. I don't know. Now we're going into paradox, right?
That's something you can't describe with words.
Yeah, this is when we start going, achintya veda veda tattva. It's inconceivable. It's unfathomable. Right? So this is the transitions of savitarka, nirvitarka, savicharda, nirvicharda that we've been going through here into the shukshma vishayatnam chalinga parivasanam of 145, taiva sabija samadhi. All of that is sabija samadhi. Nirvicharda virsayatma prasadam. This is just basically a way of saying that once you've got this nirvicharda, this atemporal perception of the shukshma alinga, part of reality, then you basically get the adhyatma, your highest self, one's highest self. And I love the term atman in Sanskrit. It's such a lovely, ambiguous, complicated term. It's always very hard. Every time you hear that word atman, you have to stop and say, now, do we just mean this in a very secular, reflexive pronoun, oneself? Do we mean this as one's individual self? Or is Atma, and I argued in my master's thesis that in some places Atman created the universe. So Atman is understood in all of these different ways. Very secular, you know, I was going to talk about Penny herself. I might say Atman, right? Or myself, you know, This just, reflects his pronoun, nothing metaphysical about it. Or we can talk about our soul, the Atman of the soul, so the Atman gets infused with this very strong sort of metaphysical dimension to it. And then even in some cases, it's divine. Like I've pointed out, Upanishadic passage where the world is created by the Atman. The Purusha is created by the Atman. Very interesting. So it's this very interesting term. But whatever the case...
Can I just ask, then it's not the same word, it's homonyms.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a lot of that in Sanskrit.
Yeah, well, because of the nature of the undying language. It's a zombie language. It's undead. And nothing dies in Sanskrit. It just keeps adding more and more and more. So yeah, the semantic range of these words get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, Maybe in the Vedas, Atman was just simply a reflexive pronoun. But by Upanishads now, it's starting to get, what does it mean to be self? I might say, I'm pouring myself a drink. Nothing so profound there until you stop and say, what does it mean to be a self? And now all of a sudden it's very hard for that reflexive pronoun to stay secular, or non-philosophical. And then everybody's going to answer that differently. So then it's going to accrue all of these other vast ideas of how people have answered that, right? So the term Atman gets very complex, and I think it's telling here that in 147, Patanjali uses the word Adhyatma, right? Adhyatma, the highest self, right? This is a way of saying that the highest dimension of Atman, of maybe the Upanishadic understanding of Atman, the highest dimension of selfhood is really Purusha, right? It's when you get the realization of Savitarka, Nirvitarka, Savicharta, Nirvicharta, you've gotten down to this essential atemporal existence, right? Prakriti and Purusha is still there. But then you realize the Adhyatma.
What does Adhyana mean?
It means the highest.
Like Maha?
Yeah. Paramatma, something like that. Very, very high. Adhyatma. Right, it's not. It's a way of, like, when you say Adhyatma, to me, what happens with the word is we now can drop its reflexive secular meaning. When we're talking about Adhyatma, we're not talking about reflexive pronoun. We're not talking about I'm pouring myself a cup of tea. We're talking about my highest self is experiencing tea, or something like that. All of a sudden, it's like there's metaphysical dimension that we're talking about here, right? So you realize this through the transition from Savitarka, Nirvitarka, Savicharta, Nirvicharta, right? The Adhyatma Pradasada. And then again we have the term Prasada comes up. So we had Chitta Prasadam way back, which I'm arguing is the subject throughout all of this in the spirit of Tola and Dragonetti. From 133 all the way up till 147, I kind of think that really what he does is he says, we've been Chitta Prasadam all through this, particularly as the subject of 140, where it's easy to get a little lost, to forget that we're talking about the nature of consciousness, and then we get all the way, Prasada comes up again in 147. So I think I think this is another strong argument in favor of Tola and Dragonetti's argument here. As they look, he just restates the subject again. 133, he says Chitta Prasadam, and then look back again in 147, we're talking about Adhyatma Prasada, right? The luminosity of your highest self. And he's restating that same subject, and it's been the subject this whole time. So I think that's a very astute observation that Tola and Dragonetti had. So we have that, and then we have there is where Rita is Bharata, is the upholding of Rita. Rita is an old Vedic way of maybe understanding Dharma as like the cosmic nature of things, right? So we actually are now going to get that prajna, that wisdom about how Rita Bharata, about how the cosmic nature of things is being upheld, right? This kind of deep, I hesitate to say ontological insight, because I think all too easily we look at ontology in a realist idea, that like somehow reality can exist apart from the observer or the consciousness. But anyway, you see how the universe works. Maybe it's more of experiential ontology, where that prajna, you really get how it all goes together, right? On a pratyaksha type of dimension, not on a mana here. Okay, and then Shrutanamagna Pragnabhyamani Vishaya Sartha, which is our current sutra, which is very interesting because now all of a sudden we're going to start talking about Nyaya. As I did last week, I started listing out the Padarthas. And
What do you need?
a stick.
I know where it is.
Thank you.
Nyaya is so complicated.
Nyaya.
Makes me tired.
It's so funny because right when I start going, wow, this is really profound, this is really deep, something will suddenly snap and I'll be like, wait a minute, all we're doing is making lists. You know, I get these moments where I'm like, I really get what's going on here. And then all of a sudden I'll be like, no, this is actually really just, you know, tedious.
It is tedious.
But
I
there,
really like it.
well, there's moments when you kind of go, oh, I get what's going on. I understand why these lists are so important. You know? But, you know, that's kind of maybe more the Vaisheshika dimension of Nyaya, you know, Nyaya with more of the syllogistic sort of argumentation. So experience is derived by the interplay of 7 padarthas, these types of aggregate components of reality. And I like to try to think about this in contrast to Prakriti and Purusha of Sankhya. In Prakriti and Purusha, we really have an interaction of two things. Prakriti and Purusha, and that's where experience comes from. Well, experience might be thought of as the relationship of Prakriti and Purusha, or maybe the coin of which Prakriti and Purusha are two sides of. I'm not really sure how you want to do that. But here we have this Nyaya Vaisheshika where we have these like 7 padarthas, right? I spent a little bit of time going into the phenomenology of Dravya versus Guna and how this leads to a prakasha, part of the prakasha understanding of consciousness, subjectivity, selfhood, which becomes very different than the sva prakasha of pretty much every other philosophical school. And this becomes a big point in which it gets kicked around a lot. You know, the idea that your Atman is a dravya, is a substance, so it's a substantialist perspective on phenomenology. Your Atman, see, we have what are the dravyas? These panchabhutas plus the direction, dik, manas, and Atman. So this it's like this kind of irreducible substance, and you can see that dravyas have a separate irreducible existence, as opposed to gunas, which are dependent on the dravya. So the gunas don't really exist unless there's a dravya. For example, the tanmatras of smell and taste and touch and all this don't really exist without the panchabhutras of the elements of existence, earth, air, fire, water, space. So in order to have a perception of that, you have to have the panchabhuta. Where the panchabhuta can exist independently, the tanmatra really can't. I'm not really sure if I'm going to go so far as to say that's a realistic understanding versus idealistic understanding. On the surface, it kind of seems that way. But where these things can be irreducible, the gunas are not. And one of our gunas is consciousness, right? Consciousness depends on Atman, but you can't see the Atman unless you have the guna of consciousness. So if you're going to say like yogaschitta vritti nirodha, whereby all the gunas are stopped and all you have is Atman by itself, nirodha, like kaivalam or kaivalyam, the Atman is itself, then really what the Nyaya says is that's like a lock. There's no perception because you need to have a consciousness to be able to look back at the Atman in order to see the Atman. So in other words, Atman is like a rock in a dark room. Consciousness is like a flashlight, and you got to have the flashlight to shine at the rock, right? This is partha prakasha, right? Something else is shining onto something else, right? It's almost a subject-object relationship that's necessary for consciousness really to work. Because consciousness by itself is nothing. It has to have something that it's conscious of.
In Nyaya philosophy.
And Nyaya, this is all Nyaya, in contrast with Yoga Sutra and pretty much almost everyone else. As opposed to Svat Prakasha, the argument the other philosophical schools will say, no, The self is actually the flashlight, maybe the light bulb within the, maybe the electricity in the flashlight. And that really the svardupa of the Purusha or the Atma is chitti. It is itself luminous. You don't need a lamp to light up the lamp. That would create an infinite reduction, right? So if I need a flashlight to see the light, then don't I need a flashlight to see that flashlight to see the light, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this kind of infinite reduction, which again, if you recall, is one of the three-part Agrippa trilema criticism of rational understanding. The guy pulling his ponytail out of the swamp. That logic is either axiomatic, infinite reduction, or circular. That's the relationship of Dravya to Guna. Right? One of these other is karma, activity. Again, it has no separate existence. It's devoid. The things that are devoid, but not everything has karma. Right? Akasha, space, kala, time, dik, direction, and Atman do not actually do anything. So they do accept that the Atman is a non-doing thing, right? But they also say other things are too, like say space, right? Space never does anything, right? Space is akarma. So karma is a fundamental component category of reality, but not all things have karma, and not all things have guna. But the Dravyas actually themselves can exist independently.
Well, what doesn't have guna besides Purusha?
The Panchabhutas can exist independently. The dik, direction, and manas, and atman. These are all Dravyas, substantial, irreducible substances that can exist independently. Gunas and karma. Karma, it makes sense. How could karma exist independently? In order for something to act, in order for there to be an action, there has to be something acting, right? In order for there to be a doing, something has to be doing. So you can't have just doing without something doing. So it has to be dependent existence. And the gunadas are qualities that are kind of like appended to dravyas, if you can think of. But that's, in a sense, neither here nor there, because really what we're talking about in this sutra is this statement, Shrutanamana pragnapyam anya vishaya vishesharthatva, right? So all of a sudden we've now switched the subject to seedless samadhi, nirdabija samadhi. If you recall, Patanjali is arguably reluctant to say, he doesn't say nirdabija samadhi, he doesn't say asampragnata. Remember when he introduced sampragnata samadhi? I don't remember where it is, he says anya, it's anya, he just referred to it as anya. Where that happens. Was that back at Niroda? Vyasa Vedaki Vyanta Niroda Tata Sitavya Vyasa Satipirga Kala Nirhante Satkar Surita the Stanisha Vitalisam Krishna Sivasikar It's not coming up for me right now. But if you recall earlier when we were talking about Samprajñata Samadhi, it's vitarka vicharda ananda smita rupa nugmat sampragnata virama pratya yabhyasa purva samskara sheshonya, right? So when we talked about the differences sampragnata and asampragnata, he doesn't use the word asampragnata, right? And then we have a similar thing here in 149, anya vishaya. He doesn't actually say nirdabija samadhi, right? It's the implied subject here. So what's argued here is that this is an epistemological statement in and of itself. To try to label something like asampragnata or sampragnata, by giving it a label, you're giving it a quality. And by giving it a quality, you're attributing something to something which is fundamentally nothing. Maybe it's abhava, if you think about it, maybe in a sense. So what some of the commentators and authors argue is that this is an actual intentional epistemological strategy on the part of the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao sort of idea, right? If you can label it, the label itself will distract from the thing, right? Because the second you label, you're still in Shabda Artha Jnana, right? Back in Vitarka Samadhi, right? Shabda Artha Jnana Vikalpa Samkirna Savitarka. But really, all we can have is the Artha. We don't want a Shabda and we don't want a Jnana. That is Samkirna that is mixing together.
I don't understand how you're saying the Panchabhutas don't have gunas. Earth, air, wind, fire.
No, I didn't say they don't have gunas. I said that they
Oh.
can exist independently of guna.
How?
Because they are essential. They're irreducible. They don't need something else. So how can you have smell without something that's smelled? You can see how smell needs something to be smelled. You have to be smelling
there's
something.
a subject-object relationship in
Yeah,
the
but the thing that's smelled, if I leave the room, the smell is still there. You know, or not that. No, the smell is not still there. The element that we perceive as smell is still there, right? So you don't necessarily need an observer to have the Panchabhutas, is kind of the argument here. Again, like I said, I'm a little hesitant to call that a realistic perspective. I have to think about that a little bit more. If Nyaya is considered realism or not, I'm drawing a blank on that right now. Yeah, so that's it. And then Karma, what the heck was that? But anyway, the point I was making is that Nirdvija Samadhi and Asampragnata Samadhi are both not called out by name. Because to call it by name would to be given a shabda, and a shabda is a discounted epistemological precision. Right? We don't want you philosophizing about this. We don't want you thinking you can describe this with words. So he intentionally doesn't call these things as they are. So, Shrutanamana Prajnabhyamanya Vishaya Vishesharta. Seedless Samadhi, the unspoken, Nirdvija Samadhi, the unspoken subject of this sutra, has a different focus, Anya Vishaya, than that of Shrutanumana, Shruti and Anumana, than that of inference. And so again, we have epistemology in here, right? Your Shruti and your Anumana, your logic and your testimony, they give you a certain thing, but Nirdvija does something different, right? Because it's without Shabda. It's more of a Pratyaksha-based epistemology. Anya Vishaya Visheshartattva has a different focus than Shruta and Anuma because it has the particularity of things as its object. This is where the epistemological statement is very strong. Because it has the arthatvat, because of, ablative, because it has the arthatvat of being vishesha. The reason why Nirdvija Samadhi is so cool is because it's specific, right? As opposed to words which are general, right? The idea is that a word is a generality. You know, I could talk about cows, and it's going to be general. I could talk about, anytime I'm using words by their very nature are a generality. They never really get to the specific of the artha, the specificity, right? Therefore, words are of an epistemologically discounted value. Again, you can't describe reality. No matter how good your model of reality is, it still isn't reality itself. Reality needs to be understood and experienced, not understood might be a good way to, I was talking with somebody recently and they were saying, well, religion is about understanding this and this and this, and I have to stop. And I have to say, well, maybe religion isn't about understanding. In the discursive sense of the word, religion has got nothing to do with understanding. That's philosophy. But maybe in an experiential sense of the term, it's about understanding with this, not necessarily with this. You can use this as a means to an end, but really it's about, and this is a statement of this epistemological, because the words will always be a samanya and not a vishesha. Okay, so here's the see, this is where the nyaya starts to come out. It's how do we understand the relationship between samanya and vishesha, between generality and specificity, right? In a general sense, a cow exists. It's a category that exists, right? Maybe it's an abstract sort of existence, right? It might not be like, it's a lack of specificity, but it still exists. You see what I'm saying? Like I always say, if you were to cut all the trees down on the planet, tree would still exist. If there was no tree left in the universe, you obliterated them all, tree would still exist from a nyaya perspective because it has a samanya existence. right? It's still there. It's a thing. It's a padartha, right? Now, the Vishesha tree, the specific tree, would be gone from existence, right? So once you've clear cut it and all the trees are gone and dead, and this is kind of a depressing example, but once the trees are all dead and gone, there's no more Vishesha. You can't talk about a specific tree anymore. There's no more pratyaksha dimension to the tree. You can't be like, I'm experiencing the tree for what it is, because it's gone. But it still exists in the sense of a padartha, and that the samanya, the generality of the tree, exists.
Well, you could still experience it because the tree's in
Maybe.
you.
In the same way we maybe experience a unicorn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Or
is
a
Vishesha-
connection with someone, when you're sitting with someone and you're so connected and then you're apart, you can still have that experience of being connected.
With them as a specific as a vishesha.
Yes, with them, yes.
Is the Vishesha more quality and Samanya would be quantity? Use that analogy.
This is actually where there's an interesting inversion in that analogy, because technically Vishesha means both. Vishesha means quantity, in that it's the specific ones. I could talk about humanity, and that's Samanya. Samanya is a quality. It's a general thing. We all have humanity, right? It's a lack of quantity. Or it's a lack of quantity, but it's a quality. It's a generality, right? Versus Vishesha, which humanity are we talking about? Oh, that human guy right there. Now we're going Vishesha. We're taking a specific, right? So in a sense, you might say, it becomes paradoxical, because actually, really, what is humanity until you understand it in a... Yeah, exactly. So in a way, I might argue that really to get to the quality of existence is really the range.
The what?
The range, right?
The range.
The range from general to Vishesha, from Samanya to Vishesha. So it becomes an interesting kind of almost contradiction in how I was saying it before, because what this is saying is that in Nirvija Samadhi, we're experiencing things Vishesha, specifically what they are. And in this case, if there's a multiplicity of jivas, of individual souls, then if I know one soul, it's not like I've encountered all of them. I have to have a Vishesha experience. So your experience of yourself is through this process of Nirvija Samadhi, that's a better epistemology than Shruta Anumana, as it says in the Sutra, Shruta Anumana Prajnavya Anya Vishaya Vishesharthan. It's a direct experience of the Visheshaness of yourself, your own uniqueness in a sense, right? Your own uniqueness, Vishesha, right? It's the quality, the essential quality, but one that's a specific quality, right? So there's the tension between Samanya and Vishesha. And what I would say here is that in the Yoga Sutra, we're discounting... I don't even know if we're discounting, because I don't know that we can say that Vitarka reality is somehow less real than Nirvicharda reality, or somehow one is more real than the other. I mean, in a sense, maybe it's just a shifting perspective. I don't know. But then again, avidya is considered to be the klesha that makes us only see part of the equation. So, you keep running up into these paradoxes, and so it gets very, very hard to apprehend. But what's happening in this sutra is this saying, it's an epistemological statement saying that words only understand things in a general way, and that Nirvija Samadhi is a way of understanding their Visheshartatvat, the artha, again, as opposed to the samkirana of Shabda Jnana and artha. But now you're just at the artha alone. We are at the thing that is referred, right? We are at the signified. Shabda and the prajna in previous sutra was the signifier. That was the artha, the signified. But now that we've dropped the signifier, which was only giving us a samanya, a generality of what was going on, now that we have only the artha, this artha is now vishesha. It's the specific uniqueness of it, the unique dimension, right? It's a quality. You've dropped away a lot of quantity. You know, you're not thinking that I'm all of this chitti jumping around. I'm all of this ahamkara. I'm all of this stuff, asmita. I'm not. You know, you've dropped away a lot of quantity, but you've gotten to this vishesha, unique quality, but in a sense that uniqueness is multiple as well too, because everything has the uniqueness, because of everything has this atman.
The uniqueness is multiple?
Well, yeah, because there's multiple purushas, the multiplicity of purushas, right? It's part of. It's not a monistic realization that we are all one soul. You know, the Visharsharthat that you're getting with Nirdvija Samadhi is a uniqueness. It's a singular essence. Your Svardupa, Tadadrasti Svardupa Vastana. Alright, so this is the inner relationship between Vishesha, particularity, and Samanya, right? And in this case, the sutra is kind of putting the Samanya is being somewhere around Nirtvitarika, right? Shabda Artha Jnana Samkirna, right? The mixing together of the Shabda and the Artha, which is still Shruta Anumana, Shrutanumana Pragnabhyan Anyavishaya Visheshartatvat. But really, once you start letting go of the Shabda and the Prajna, the discursive mind, and only the signified is remaining, it becomes a uniqueness. Right? You are understanding the uniqueness. You're not just thinking about yourself in general terms of what it's like to be one of those humans. You're thinking about what is it like to be this, and I don't mean human, one of those souls. Now you're thinking about what it's like to be this soul. Right? You've made the transition from samanya, which is discursive, to pratyaksha, based on direct apprehension of your own uniqueness, the essential quality, right? Now I should amend this to say that the commentators aren't entirely comfortable with saying that pratyaksha, direct experience, is without samanya as well too. You know, they kind of almost distinguish between the kind of pratyaksha that's like, you know, you may see things with your senses, and that doesn't mean you're really apprehending them, because pratyaksha can be taken as like a sensory perception. They're saying, no, this is an experiential dimension of this. Okay. Yeah, vishesha can be thought of. This is a good statement. Is what particularizes ultimate entities from each other, right? You know, we have the samanya padartha of Atman, of ourselves, the general category. We're all the self. In a sense, we're all the same samanya. But then in another sense, another real sense, we're in a particular self as well, too. This almost kind of starts sounding a little Veda-like, right? So on one level, we're all samanya, we're all one, we're all Atman. On another level, we're vishesha, we're specific Atmans. And if both padarthas, generality and specificity, have ontological status, then really both perspectives are true, and therefore we have this kind of achintya paradox.
Achintya paradox?
Achintya. Achintya means incomprehensible. When I think of the word achintya, I think of it as best paradoxical. You know? I like that word best. It literally means like unthinkable or something, right? But I think of the word achintya best as it's a paradox. You know, you keep jumping on both sides of this paradox trying to make sense of something that's like, you know, wave-particle duality. How does that work again? How is it that an electron is both a wave and a particle? Oh yeah, it's a particle because of this, but then it's also a wave because of this. But how can it be both and neither and both and neither, both and both? You know, you start getting to this point where you're just going, what's going on? You know, and this is an epistemological realization that the words are not really doing it anymore. We need a more pratyaksha approach, one of a direct experience, right? Okay, so this is what I was going to say, the deficiency of pratyaksha. Yeah, just the range of this. So samadhi becomes a very specific type of pratyaksha, one that's not just like I think the commentators here are saying something to the effect of be careful that your direct experience isn't just a sense perception, because actually really in sense perception you're still perceiving generality, right? Like I'm seeing this general clothing or something. I'm not perceiving the anus, the atoms, you know. I'm looking at it as this general thing. In a sense, your sense perceptions are these very general experiences. You're not really getting down to the specific thing that it essentially is, right? As opposed to samadhi is a type of extrasensory pratyaksha. You know, if you think about your normal sensory pratyaksha, that might be more like the pixelization on a computer screen. You know, like you're, you know, taking in the data and reconstructing it in your mind and creating a picture, so you're actually watching TV. You're not actually there at the place that's on TV, but you're, oh yeah, doing this. But then samadhi becomes more like that kshina vritirtha abhijata seva manirtha, right? The abhijata seva manirtha, as if it's like a clear crystal. Your samadhi perception becomes more something like you are really actually apprehending it, so much so that you don't even see the mind anymore. You know, that little thing you were doing before where you're creating pixelization and representing reality, that's now gone. Now you're actually directly apprehending reality. And I'm not entirely sure what modern science's position is on that. It seems to me that it's mostly like, no, you can't. Like, I think that, I'm not sure, I don't have the expertise in this, but my suspicion is that modern science would say that really all of our perception is a matter of, you know, pixelization, to lack of a better word, that we are really just taking in sensory data, it's hitting our neurosynapses, it's going up into our brain, it's constructing a picture of reality, and so all we're ever doing is kind of this solipsistic sort of watching our own constructions of our mind. And can you actually apprehend reality, or are you all just always living in your mental construction of reality? And I'm not entirely sure that science believes that you can go beyond your own mental constructions of reality. I'm not quite sure that they can. Yeah.
You're limited by your own mental construction, your own sensory perception.
But not according to samadhi. According to samadhi, actually, you're able to bypass that completely and experience a thing as it is, right?
This is a higher level of consciousness that maybe science doesn't accept.
Yeah, it's kind of extrasensory perception, right? Isn't that what that is?
Right.
Yeah, by definition, that's extrasensory perception. That is
Using your
ESP.
senses.
Yeah, yeah. And there's atemporal, too. So maybe the idea of, like, reading the future wouldn't be so off. It was, was that Nicole who just went off on that crazy stuff last week? And on the surface, it's like, well, man, where's she going with this? She's watching too much TV. But really, there's something to be said about, like, okay, so are we in the realm of ESP and, reading the future, and next thing you know, we're going to grab the crystal ball, and, I don't know that that's that far off when you start talking about atemporal existence and perceiving reality in a way that doesn't use your sensory perception.
Yeah,
So,
we were talking about dreams earlier, right? And talking about how they sort of not foreshadow the future, but give you a sense of what your future is or needs to be or is going to be.
yeah. Well, let's also keep in mind that we have Vibhuti Pada, an entire chapter that's like magical powers, right? And so when you first flip open the Yoga Sutra, you're like, chapter 1, really cool. Chapter 2, yeah, that's pretty cool. Chapter 3, oh my God, what is this crazy yoga stuff? Close the book. This is nonsense. But you can kind of understand how this philosophy can lend itself to some pretty extraordinary vibhuti, siddhi, right? Now, they also make the point to let us know that other epistemologies are still important, because agama, shabda, shruti, testimony, it provides us with information about which path to follow. Anumana helps us remove doubts, and pratyaksha allows us to directly experience the truth, right? If you guys didn't have that, oh wow, eureka moment when I was talking, then why would you be listening to me? So something inside of you is giving you a direct experience. We are getting beyond shabda and agama. We got the agama, maybe, if you will, of the teachers, right? Or maybe what I tell you, my experience, in my classroom, right? There's some agama, some testimony. The shabda is the word. But if you didn't have a pratyaksha component, you wouldn't still be sitting here. If you weren't kind of going, oh wow, I think I see something. You're somehow experiencing what we're talking about, or you wouldn't have the interest and the enthusiasm necessary to keep coming here week after week and listening to me ramble.
Well, it would just wash through you.
Yeah. Well, it would be like my early experiences with mythology. You know, when I first started, studying Eastern thought, I read the philosophy and I'd be like, yeah, and then I'd read the mythology. I'd be like, what? What planet does this make sense? It took me a very long time before you could tell me about Rama, and I would cry. I can cry. I can almost get tears in my eyes right now when I think of Rama. It took me a long time to get to that point before there's a pratyaksha now there for me.
It's like you have a personal relationship. You relate to
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're feeling it. You're experiencing it, right? So yeah, the good news is that we are actually getting some pratyaksha dimension of reality here, even though we're just talking. There's something that's still going on, right? Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna.
Oh yes. So we'll finish this up right here. I think I've finished off this lesson sufficiently. So next time we will start moving on to these are some of my favorite sutras. Tajja samskarda nya samskarda pratibandini tasyapti nirdhoda sardva nirdhoda nirbija samadhi iti samadhi padaha. Right. So tajja samskarda nya samskarda this is like the what I call the Terminator seed samskarda. Right. The samskarda is born out of nirbija samadhi. Well, actually, nirbija is not really, but the tambarda, the sabija samadhi creates its bija. It's still creating samskaras. That one is actually obstructing the other samskaras. So in a sense, you're creating the karma that's going to stop the karma, the Terminator seed, right? That's what I say. Tajja samskarta nya samskarta pratibandini intasyapti nirdhoda sarva nirdhoda nirbija samadhi. But eventually, you need to stop even that stuff, right? Cessation of even that tambarda. Even the sabija samadhi, as cool as sabija samadhi is, ultimately we have to let go of that as well too, right? You can't keep holding on to the thing that's taking. You can't stay on the train forever. You're trying to get somewhere, but you really like the train. Eventually, you have to get off the train, right? So that's what's happening here with our last two sutras, very beautifully, and then we end up with the. With Samadhi Pada, and then we start Sadhana Pada with a whole new understanding of yoga, right? Tapas Svadhyaya Yeshwarada Pranidhanani Kriya Yoga. Now that we've looked at all this Samadhi stuff, let's talk about like boots on the ground, Sadhana Pada, right? Okay?
Sahana Vavatu, Sahano Bunatu, Sahaviryam Karavavahe, Tejasvina Vanitamastu Ma Virvishavahe. Om Sarvesham Svastir Bhavatu, Sarvesham Shantir Bhavatu, Sarvesham Purnam Bhavatu, Sarvesham Mangalam Bhavatu, Sarve Bhavantu Sukhina, Sarve Santu Niramaya, Sarve Bhadrani Pashantu Makashchit Dukhabhag Bhavit. Asatoma Satgamaya, Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya, Mrityorma Amritatgamaya. Om Purnamadam Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.